St. Petersburg, Russia's window to Europe, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution and the hero city during an unprecedented siege in the war against Hitler's Germany. Since Soviet times, a memorial has stood here, commemorating the heroic inhabitants of the city, then known as Leningrad, who bravely defied the German Wehrmacht's advance during what is known as the Great Patriotic War from 1941 to 1945, the Eastern Campaign of World War II.
No one thought that the war would last so long. And in Leningrad, no one could have imagined that the city would be surrounded and blockaded so swiftly, and that it would undergo such hardship. War itself is a nightmare, but war combined with siege, I don't think there's any word in the dictionary to describe it.
It was an unprecedented trial of the human soul. Never before in history was there any example of such a huge city of more than 2 million people being subjected to such an ordeal.
The horrors of those months of hunger have primarily been passed down in journal entries. In personal diaries, the tormented inhabitants confided their deepest thoughts and most terrible memories.
You must not think about all the terribleness of the war, otherwise you'll go grey. You have to protect yourself, as those in Leningrad did. They numbed themselves. No normal human being can tolerate so much horror every day if he thinks about it more deeply.
The diaries tell inconceivable stories of human suffering and a complete emotional deadening towards it. For 872 days, the city was besieged by the Germans. It's an incredible story of heroism and human failure. World War II seemed distant, as seen from Moscow and the rest of the Soviet Union, when on June 22, 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers marched east from Poland and East Prussia. In Leningrad, it was considered inappropriate to be concerned about international events and lend credence to unhealthy moods, as they were called. War is being waged somewhere in Europe, one citizen said shortly before the attack, for 2 years now. So what?
It was a beautiful Sunday. We went for a walk on the morning of June the 22nd, and in fact the war had already broken out. Molotov announced it on the radio, and everyone was shocked. People thought, the Germans, who cares? We'll throw our caps at them. In other words, we'll quickly defeat them with the sheer mass of our countrymen.
The German attack on Leningrad triggered a wave of patriotism. Even before the order fell on June 27th to mobilize for civil protection, hundreds of thousands of volunteers signed up voluntarily.
They're all taken into this Narodne Opolchenia and thrown into the front line from early July onwards with 2-3 days training. One rifle per 20, 50 men, no communications equipment, no transport, nothing. Actually, I slightly exaggerate. The first two divisions, the first two groups had proper uniforms and relatively normally equipped, but the later divisions were sent to the front line with nothing, and they were all cut to pieces, absolutely cut to pieces.
We called it the People's Front, because people were in the army regardless of their age. The only thing we'd learned in school was how to use gas masks. That's all we knew. When they were given weapons, they didn't even know where the trigger was or how to use it.
One 18-year-old wrote to his girlfriend, "I'll be witness to an unusual, very significant event. I'm going to the front. This is a test on me, my views, inclinations and traits. I'm being given the opportunity to dive into the vortex of life." In the first few days, Hitler's Wehrmacht met with little resistance. Taken by complete surprise, the defenders were easy prey for the advancing German tanks. Counterattacks by the Red Army came to nothing. Most of the units were poorly organized, some didn't even have live ammunition.
The original plan under Barbarossa was this three-pronged attack, as we know. And there was the Army Group North, Centre and South, and Army Group North would head for Leningrad and Army Group Centre would head for Moscow, and they would be taken simultaneously. The German armies raced through the Baltics very quickly, welcomed with open arms by many Balts. So they get to Leningrad at the end of August, so incredibly quickly, only just over 2 months after the initial invasion.
By August 1941, 3/4 of the city were surrounded. Hitler was determined to destroy the city that bore Lenin's name and kill all people so they needn't be fed in winter.
As for the question of what to do with the population, Hitler's orders and other consultations formed clear instructions not to let the inhabitants out. Where would they go, and how to supply them? The Germans were already struggling with masses of war prisoners they couldn't feed. What would they do with 2 to 2.5 million more civilians? And even if they'd been evacuated, where were they to go? There were German forces everywhere.
Leningrad Party chief Andrei Zhdanov raised the alarm in mid-August. Our beloved hometown is threatened by the imminent invasion of the fascist German troops. Armed with an iron discipline and Bolshevik determination, we will confront the enemy bravely and deal him a crushing blow. But the German superiority was overwhelming. On September 8, 1941, the last remaining land connection between Leningrad and the rest of the country was cut off.
Despite impending defeat near Moscow, Hitler was unrelenting. No, not Leningrad. Let's destroy it to the ground. He was shown that it wasn't technically possible. The whole General Staff tried explaining to him that there was no reason to invade the city and get entangled in street fighting. There'd be heavy losses. Tanks couldn't maneuver in those conditions. They tried convincing him that the city would soon surrender. It was surrounded. All the railway lines were interrupted. Leningrad would have to capitulate.
Now it was up to the German Luftwaffe to force the city to surrender. Nearly 3 million civilians were under siege in early winter 1941. Among them were 700,000 non-working dependents and 400,000 children. Right after the end of World War II, a gigantic museum was built to chronicle the horrors of the Leningrad blockade. But Stalin had it destroyed in 1948 out of fear of its power to unify the people. Not until 1989 was a smaller museum opened. It's devoted to collecting exhibition pieces, documents and memories. With its limited resources, it tells the story of the German advance in 1941, Stalinist society in the former Soviet Union and the military measures taken to defend the city on the Neva River. Its curator is especially proud of the collection of diaries from the time of the siege. They survived the war and all the purges thereafter.
They're of extraordinary importance because they're a historical documentation. There are also other reports, testimonials and memoirs by survivors, which may describe things that never actually happened. It helps if I have a diary or several diaries that contain similar descriptions. You have the same date. One lives here and the other in another part of town. The one person works for an organization, the other's a teacher, then a third person, a child, and another who works in the cultural sector. And all of them describe the same events at the same time.
On June 22, 1941, a citizen of Leningrad wrote, "Fascist Germany has treacherously attacked our country." He went on to write, "The first air raid alarm sounded in the night of the 22nd.
People did find enormous comfort, both in literature, in reading, and in putting down their thoughts on paper. And I was amazed at how reckless lots of my diarists were, because you never knew when the NKVD wasn't going to turn up on outside your door, rap on the door, and search your flat, haul you off to the Kresty prison. But nonetheless, people did unburden themselves to their diaries, and they put down very frankly often what they thought of the war, what was going to happen. They said, we can't believe what the news from the front, we can't believe anything we're being told.
A note by writer Anna Akhmatova reads, "Leningrad is unusually suitable for disasters, with its cold river and constant heavy clouds overhead, its menacing sunsets and fearsome operatic moon." Hitler insisted on Leningrad's total destruction, the hated city of the October Revolution. Airstrikes were part of everyday life in the first few months of the siege. Ceaseless bombardment was meant to wear down the defenders and force them to surrender. By the year's end, the German forces had bombarded the city 272 times. Thousands of innocent civilians, many of them children, died in the rubble. By evening, the soul was paralyzed, noted a doctor who had to examine the bodies. On display at the Siege Museum is an original map that unmistakably shows the sheer dimensions of Nazi Germany's will to destroy. It documents that by December the 31st, 1941, 3,295 explosive bombs were dropped on the city, 99,717 firebombs and 30,154 artillery shells. The Germans' main targets were the depots and factories that ensured the survival of the 2 million trapped inside. Within the first few days, food storage facilities, fuel tanks, a dairy and 38 warehouses with food reserves went up in flames. For Nina, who was 11 years old at the time, the bombing soon became a normality.
There were air raids every night, always at the same time, according to plan, typically German, very accurate. I don't remember exactly anymore. At around 2 or 3 o'clock at night, the siren sounded. We children were woken up, had to get dressed, and were taken to the bomb shelter. It was terrible. Bombs are terrible. If a bomb comes flying, you can hear it. It whines. You think it's going to hit you, even though it is actually relatively far away.
The air sirens sent the people into the shelters almost daily. The whistling death, as the people of Leningrad called it, befell 16,747 civilians. More than 33,000 were wounded. One of the diaries kept in the Leningrad Blockade Museum meticulously records the time of each attack, from initial alarm till all clear. The writer noted, "Sometimes you go to work wondering if the building will still be there. Then you go home wondering if the house is still standing." Describing the rubble, writer Lydia Ginsburg wrote, "The torn-up buildings exposed their system of stories. Bewildered, the person begins to realize that he's floating in the air when sitting in his room at home, and that other people are hovering too, above his head and beneath his feet. But the danger from the skies was no longer the only threat. Food reserves became scarce within a few weeks.
I don't remember when the food ration cards were introduced, but I do recall that there was eventually a barley card for lentils. The Germans threw leaflets at us, and one of them said, "By the time you've eaten up your lentils, you'll have given up Leningrad." I don't remember how or where, but we countered that with, "We're eating our lentils, but we'll never surrender the city."
Factories and power stations in the south of the city were bombed the most severely. Their very existence was one of the main reasons the leaders refused to abandon Leningrad, or at the very least vacate it.
One of the big questions of the siege is why was there no mass evacuation of surplus civilians before the siege ring closed? And that failure to organise a mass evacuation is the biggest single contributor to the massive size of the death toll, the 750,000 civilian death toll during the siege. Two main reasons for this. First of all, getting factories out, which meant equipment plus their staff, so people as well as equipment, and getting troop movements took priority, and of course transport capacity was limited. There were only so many trains. The second big reason is fear of accusation of defeatism. You can't start organising an evacuation because that implies that Leningrad is going to be surrounded. If you think Leningrad's going to be surrounded, you are a defeatist, you are a traitor to the Soviet Socialist Republic.
A ration card for meat and meat products from October 1941 documented the waning supply. "No replacement should you lose this card," it says as a warning. A big scale in the blockade museum symbolizes the drastic food rationing. One commodity above all was in particular demand and was weighed according to ration cards with utmost precision down to the gram: bread.
There wasn't enough flour for bread. Rations were reduced at least 5 times. The worst one, 125 grams, which many remember, started to be issued on November the 25th, 1941, if you could even call it bread. By that time, less than half of it was made from flour. The rest was a mixture of malt and bran. It was terrible. In their journals, people wrote over and over again that the bread was black as clay. It had to be dried before you could eat it. It was sliced into portions. 125 grams was the ration for non-workers and children. Manual labourers got 250 grams. There were different categories. For heavy workers in the mills, there were bonuses.
While the propaganda suggested that enough bread could be baked for everyone, children, the elderly and the infirm were given only 3 thin slices of bread per day, along with a ridiculously small amount of meat and fat. People with jobs could consider themselves lucky because they got twice the amount of bread.
My aunt had a ration card for workers at the time, so she got 250 grams of bread. Non-workers and we children got only 125 grams. And what kind of bread was it? Pumice and sawdust. I remember eating at school for a while. I don't remember what or how much, but it was all on ration cards. Then my aunt became ill. We were all very hungry, and very quickly we were weakened by dystrophy and malnutrition.
Growing children, non-working women and the elderly were especially hard hit by the rationing. 460 calories were issued for ration card owners in the lower category, a quarter of what an adult needs to maintain weight. The early onset of winter in mid-October made things even worse. First hunger, then cold. At first, people helped each other as best they could. But that changed as the number of deaths grew.
People's behaviour very quickly starts to change. One example of this is what you do when you see someone collapsed on the street in front of you. And this is something nearly every diarist experiences. And in the first couple of months, people experience this as a moral dilemma. What do I do? Do I help this person? Do I get this person to a police station and risk not getting to my workplace and picking up this little carton of sort of metal churn of soup, which then I can take back to my family, or risk, not getting my ration at the bread store, which I can take back to my family? Or do I forget about that and help the person? It's what do I do? Do I help my family, or do I help this poor collapsed person in front of me? And people feel guilty about ignoring these war-starved people on the street. But once you get to December, the guilt has disappeared, people ignore it.
Corpses on the street were an everyday sight. The death toll rose week by week. From January to March 1942, around 300,000 died in Leningrad.
I remember seeing bodies on sleds, just wrapped in sheets. People could hardly stand on their feet, but still they pulled the sleds. We didn't know where they brought the dead. A mass grave? People lay dying in the streets.
My father lived in the barracks at the Zhdanov plant, like in the army. He lived and slept in a dormitory. At night, they drove through the streets collecting corpses. That was their job, their duty. They received 100 grams of alcohol for it and a piece of bread. On days off, he visited us at our aunt's. We all slept in a bed next to each other, head to foot. He could barely stand up. Then I overheard a conversation in the kitchen about my father soon not coming home anymore. He already had scurvy.
People got around by foot. There was no more public transportation. In the railway stations, the trains stood unused. No help from outside was anywhere in sight.
Sleds were the main mode of transport. They were used to carry the sick, wood. If you were able to find or buy any, and water. But where were you to get water? There were no wells in the city. You were lucky when a water pipe burst, like on Nevsky Avenue or Sadovaya Street. A bomb struck the water lines, and many people collected the water that poured out. It was like that on other streets too.
Old Man Winter was particularly ruthless that year. The population hunted desperately for water. Women had the particularly hard work of hauling the tediously filled buckets back to their apartment buildings.
Never before and never since have meteorologists measured temperatures of minus 38 degrees in Leningrad. You couldn't heat the houses. People didn't undress. They covered up with everything to go to sleep. At night, their hair froze to the blankets. You couldn't go to the bathroom, especially in the 4-, 5- and 6-story buildings. There wasn't any water. Since there wasn't anything to eat, most were too weak to go out, so they used buckets, which were then emptied into the street. The city was on the brink of collapse.
Fear and death numbed you. My mother prayed that God take us and put an end to the misery. We'd already grown accustomed to the raiding rats and everything else. It was particularly bad at night. We were pressed closely to our mother. It was terribly cold. We wrapped ourselves up tightly in blankets so that the rats couldn't attack us. Instead, they just ran around on top of us.
People only left their homes to go to work or organize food. The supply would have been easier had Stalin not personally prevented additional supplies before the beginning of the blockade. Ration cards were issued under strict control. Unauthorized reproduction was harshly punished. Replacement cards were only available in exceptional cases.
When fetching bread, you had to take it quickly so that it wasn't snapped up by people standing close to the scale. Otherwise, they'd take it and quickly stuff it into their mouths. That was severe hunger. It's terrible and makes people go to extremes. If you didn't want anyone to take your bread, you had to grab it quickly and hide it.
People were constantly on the lookout for more food.
Once, when I was out, I saw a Red Army soldier transporting a box of ammunition by cart. The horse could barely move. He cracked the whip, yelled at the horse, and then it fell down. People appeared from everywhere and began cutting pieces of meat from it. They carved it up with an axe. The soldier had a gun and shot it into the air. I said, "Why are you shooting? That won't bring him back to his feet." The horse was butchered alive.
The last remaining animals at Leningrad Zoo faced similar fates, as did beloved pets at home. Eventually, they ended up on the stove. Cats and dogs were considered a delicacy. "We found and killed a cat," it says in this diary entry from December 2nd, 1941. The following day, it glibly reads, "We ate fried cat, very tasty." The brutalization didn't stop there. Starvation did its part to estrange neighbors, friends, and even families.
We lived at our grandma's and someone stole all her ration cards. We knew who did it, her youngest daughter, Antonia. My aunt. You can condemn her for it or not, but her own children were starving. You be the judge. Did she do something bad? Yes, but her children were worth more to her than an old mother. That's how things were at that time.
Starvation, the fierce cold and hopeless situation changed people beyond recognition. They didn't even shy away from cannibalism. For decades, the terrible phenomenon was hushed by censors. Reports of cannibalism during the siege were taboo. Not until the end of the Soviet Union did survivors dare to reveal the gruesome stories.
During famine, not all people behaved the same. Some would sooner have died than resorted to stealing, let alone killing. Others went out of their minds and started to believe that human flesh tasted like chicken. They went hunting for it. They not only ate it, they also traded it commercially and sold it as chopped meat.
An old woman brought aspic from the market and offered to give us some. We were little boys and, of course, pounced on it immediately. My mother took a closer look at it and found human fingernails in it. Not even that put people off. Everything was used. My mother would rather have died than eaten that. The old woman ate it up. My brother and I wailed because we were hungry, but my mother wouldn't let us eat it.
On the cannibalism, there are two very important points to make. First of all, this was not, in the vast majority of cases, there were 2,015 arrests for cannibalism in total up till the end of 1942, when this phenomenon finally petered out. The vast, vast majority of those were not murder for food. It was just people scavenging meat from corpses, often from the cemeteries. And the majority of cannibals The vast majority of cannibals, again, were not these sort of degenerate lowlifes of myth. They were the people at the bottom of the social heap. They were women whose husbands were away at the front. Most of them were uneducated, most of them unskilled. They were from the villages. They were people who'd come before the war into the city to find work, peasant women from the villages. And so they lacked a support network of relatives and friends in Leningrad to help them out.
Writer Daniel Granin, who experienced the Leningrad blockade as a young soldier, has collected reports and testimonials given by siege survivors. The story told by one mother shows how far people would go, driven by their desperation.
A boy had died, and his mother put his body in the window frame. She didn't have the strength to bury him. Then she cut off pieces of him bit by bit to feed her daughter. Everyone had their own siege, their own story. None resembled the others. They may seem similar, the bodies, deaths, losses, but for each individual, it was always something very personal.
More than 37,000 items stored at the first siege museum were destroyed in 1948 at Stalin's behest. But the creators of the new museum were able to track down other originals, such as these goosefoot and bran patties fried in engine oil.
People tried to make food from anything they could get in the city. There's a huge number of recipes to make cheese, cottage cheese and curd, from heaven knows what. They tried to make aspic from carpenter glue boiled with bay leaves and pepper. That was quite something. People also ate press cake. They'd eat anything just to survive. The diaries contain references to baby powder, lip balm and engine oil. Patties were pressed from grass dug out from under the snow. Anything made of leather was boiled for a very, very long time, sometimes for days at a time.
There's the story of Miss Achapkina. She had 2 children who were dying of starvation in her arms. The only thing she could do was feed them her blood. She cut her arms, pressed out the blood, and gave it to them to drink.
The people of Leningrad were being buried alive while outside the Germans calmly waited for disaster to set in, a catastrophe they had wittingly caused. By the end of 1941, the official death toll numbered 54,000. Many of them were buried in mass graves at Piskayovskoye Cemetery. Nowadays, the Smolny Institute is the seat of the St. Petersburg city administration. This is where the Bolsheviks planned the October Revolution in 1917. After the overthrow of the Kerensky government, the former convent building became the headquarters of the local Communist Party. Andrei Tsedanov was in charge of the city during the Siege of Leningrad. Any attempt by the Communist Party leader to surrender the city was nixed by Stalin. He strived to see the city hold out for as long as possible, providing soldiers and equipment to defend the country.
Zhdanov's conversations with and reports to Stalin, and the same applies to the NKVD reports from Leningrad to headquarters in Moscow, very much concentrated on what was going on at the front. They were interested in military events and, the next offensive, the next redeployment. 9/10 of what they talked about was the military stuff. And then at the end of every report, you get a little bit about the the situation inside the city. And it will normally, and it'll cover, it does indeed cover food supply, and it covers the death rate. But I think supplying the city, trying to save civilians, is not top of mind. It is not the priority. It's seen as a sort of, inevitable thing that's happening on the side, and we've just got to deal with it and carry on defending the city.
All the German attempts to bring Leningrad to its knees failed. The inhabitants did everything they could to defend the city. One of the Red Army soldiers on the Leningrad front was writer Daniel Granin.
It was the only besieged city that didn't capitulate during World War II. Despite the blockade, Leningrad didn't raise the white flag, although Hitler anticipated that it yield by September or October of 1941. The Germans knew exactly what was going on in the city, that people were dying and corpses were lying on the streets. They knew it from intelligence and from what prisoners told them.
In December 1941, the death toll rose by leaps and bounds, even though the city government had been trying for weeks to find food within the siege perimeter and invent substitutes for food. A rationing system decided the fate of the close to 3 million civilians trapped inside the ring. Officially, each of them was to be supplied according to personal need.
No rationing system could have saved everybody. The mouths were too many and the food stocks were too few. The mistakes were made before the siege ring closed. On the other hand, the rationing system could have been better administered. And it was absolutely ruthless the way it was designed. Basically, people in non-manual jobs and dependents, non-working people, were basically consigned to starvation. They were allowed to die in order to save the factory workers in defence factories and the soldiers in the Red Army.
According to Soviet propaganda, Leningrad factories were still producing armaments. If the tanks, field guns and mortars had been used to defend the city, they might have helped the Red Army to fight free a safe land route out of the city. But massive production for the Central Front deprived Leningrad of many means to fracture the German blockade and thus rescue hundreds of thousands of civilians. The front needs it. We make it. Read the banners hanging in Leningrad factories. But most of the products made in Leningrad didn't benefit the city's own defense. Instead, they went to the Central Front to prevent the Germans from taking Moscow. Manufacturing the grenades and mines required precious fuel supplies that were desperately needed to heat the freezing homes that winter. For weeks, the Red Army deterred the capture of Leningrad. Suffering debilitating losses, it managed to prevent a German invasion. Among the many casualties, many volunteer units served as cannon fodder for Stalin. In early December 1941, developments came thick and fast. Hitler's emaciated front forces had to end their advance in the face of Arctic-like snowdrifts. Stalin's strategic reserve arrived in time from Siberia to launch a massive counterattack. The Soviet propaganda machine distributed photographs of destroyed German convoys, seized weapons and masses of German prisoners. But in fact, Hitler's Wehrmacht and Stalin's Red Army were wearing themselves down in an embittered winter battle for Moscow, with no major strategic gains for either side. The Soviet government had already been evacuated in September in case the capital should yield. Had Hitler's troops seized Moscow, Leningrad probably wouldn't have been able to hold out any longer. In December 1941, newspaper Pravda joyfully announced the failure of Germany's plan to surround and take Moscow. For Leningrad too, there finally seemed to be hope. commanders had eagerly awaited for Lake Ladoga in the northeast to freeze over, so that vehicles could drive over the ice to help supply the city and evacuate the most needy. By late November, the ice was thick enough. The Soviets said that material and food could easily be sent into the beleaguered city. Eventually, there were 6 parallel routes, but crossing the lake was a lengthy, cumbersome and dangerous affair. Again and again, vehicles fell through the ice, but still 270,000 tons of food and 90,000 tons of fuel made it into the starving and bitter cold city. But the food supply still fell far short of demand. According to official figures, 96,000 more civilians died in each of the first 2 months of 1942. The city government finally opted for a major evacuation, even though the raging snowstorms meant a very dangerous 160-kilometer journey for the inhabitants. It became known as the Road of Life.
They did everything to get as many people out of Leningrad as possible, by any possible means. It was easier to evacuate them than it was to feed them, unless they were needed for work or on the front, because the front required constant reinforcements. So they pulled out all the stops to get people out across Lake Ladoga.
And so Leningraders made the arduous journey into safer backcountry, where at least supplies were guaranteed. Many of the evacuees were children. One official report noted that the number of orphans had shot so high that the authorities had to seek accommodations for them. Many of the children were malnourished and in need of medical care.
If it was cold in the city, 39 degrees below zero, then you can imagine what it was like on Lake Ladoga, that white desert of ice. It was minus 45 degrees. The diarists describe how the vehicles had to drive through that. They were roofless transport trucks packed with children, some of whom had lost their parents. Members of Komsomol searched the houses and gathered up children who were often found sitting next to their mothers' dead bodies. The mothers had given their children the last of what they had to keep them alive. Babies from 6 months to 2 or 3 years old were found crying next to their mothers' corpses. They were gathered up, loaded onto trucks, and taken through that cruel cold across Lake Ladoga. Then the fascist Aryan master race came flying at them and dropped bombs on those trucks full of children. There was no escape. An adult might have been able to save himself from a sinking vehicle, but the kids were perched like little sparrows and simply sank with all their belongings into the lake.
The Germans controlled the airspace over Leningrad. With targeting bombing, the Germans tried to destroy the last remaining lifeline connecting Leningrad to the outside world, the so-called Road of Life. Ultimately, the airstrikes failed to permanently interrupt the path of escape across the frozen lake. And so, about 1 million people could be evacuated via the lifeline. But by springtime, the days of heavy transport across the lake came to a foreseeable end. The cargo trucks used the ice for as long as they could to get vital supplies into Leningrad. But sometime in April, it was no longer possible for the convoys to travel to and from the city. Boats and ships had to take over, but their capacity was much lower and the crossing took much longer. In the spring of 1942, the city slowly awakened from the trance of winter. News from the front wasn't good. All attempts to break the siege had failed. From January to April, the Red Army lost 300,000 of its combatants on the northern fronts. The city administration had its hands full trying to improve its care of the population. Rations were raised slightly. The Leningraders began to break out of their bubbles and starting feeling human emotions once again. It was a rude awakening for the many who'd been numbed by starvation. deeply suppressed feelings were set free.
The coming of spring, people begin to return to their normal personalities, the survivors. And the first thing, of course, is that they suffer terrible survivor's guilt. And you get people looking back at their own behaviour during the siege and saying, why, did I eat that last biscuit? Why didn't I give it to Oleg, who was dying in hospital? Or, I can't believe that I ignored my neighbour Irina and did nothing to help her. Now I can't look her daughter in the eye. It's people look back at what they have become and they can hardly believe it.
But people gradually awakened. Life returned to the city. Finally, the great evacuation could begin. By the end of the year, the population had dropped to 600,000, down from 2.5 million when the siege began. Those able to leave soon realized that people elsewhere in the country knew nothing or only very little about the Leningrad tragedy. You can talk about anything, said poet Olga Bergolz, just not about the victims of starvation, not a word. Anything about the courage and heroism of Leningrad, that's what we need, but not a word about the hunger. Increasing numbers of children were taken out of the city. In the spring and summer of 1942 alone, 38,000 orphans were evacuated, according to official documents. The next winter would be on its way, and the fewer miners there were in the city, the better. A first train arrived at Finland Station in February 1943. It is said to have transported butter for the children, as well as young cats intended to combat the scourge of rats. Though the Germans targeted the railway line for several months, it continued to be the city's most important lifeline. People were bunkering down for the second winter in the besieged city, stocking up on food and fuel, retreating to their homes and sealing the windows shut. Civilian rations were on a par with Moscow. Another round of mass mortality could be prevented because by this time help came from the Allies. Through an agreement, the US sent munition and supplies to the Soviet Union. These propaganda films depicted the airlift for Leningrad. In January 1944, the Red Army began its offensive to force the Germans to end the siege. After a total of 2 years and 4 months, Hitler's Wehrmacht finally had to retreat under a ceaseless hail of bullet fire. On January 27, 1944, the war in this part of the Soviet Union came to an end. At 7:45 p.m., the commanding general of the Leningrad front, Leonid Govorov, and members of the military council, Sedanov and Kuznetsov, proclaimed the German defeat. The blockade is over. The savage artillery shelling is finished. Death to the German invaders. An eyewitness wrote in her diary that it was the greatest event in the life of Leningrad. Leningrad is free, she continued, but her prophecy was premature. Stalinism suppressed the savagery of the siege. For decades, the communist version of the story reigned, glorifying the heroism of Leningrad and its citizens. Only in recent years have survivors and historians been able to reveal the ghoulish truth.
Цензура нам не позволила рассказать о людоедстве.
Censorship didn't permit us to talk about the cannibalism, counterfeit ration cards, or about the cakes baked in the Smolny.
The Siege of Leningrad is an unprecedented tragedy. Never before had a city of that size endured such suffering. The city was cut off for 870 days. Of the nearly 3 million people who lived there, only 600,000 were left. Well over 1 million died during the siege, most of them from starvation or exposure to the freezing cold. It is an incredible story of indomitable human will and capacity for suffering. of heroism and human error. And it is one of the worst German war crimes during the Second World War.